The best possible movement is the movement of people in chase of economic opportunities. The worst possible movement is when people are running away of lack of services in rural areas. So the recipe that we advocate very strongly in the World Development Report 2009 and in reports since is that you have to ensure that there are adequate schools, adequate health facilities, good rural roads, outreach to increase the productivity of farming, so that when people are walking away from rural areas, they're doing so not in the pursuit of better services, but equipped to jump into the agglomerations that are happening in urban areas.
Taro is the capital of Kiribati. Kiribati has a population of roughly 100,000, spread over something like 18 populated coral atolls. Presently, there's been a very substantial migration since independence in the 1970s to South Taro at the capital city. So something like 35% of the population now live there. So about 35,000 people live on a tiny fragment of one particular coral atoll.
You said it had the density of Hong Kong, population
Same density, slightly more than Hong Kong, which you can imagine the pressures that places on a small island for things like water supplies, for sewerage, for employment, for housing and so on. So very intense pressures. And alongside that is the fact that this is a coral atoll. The highest point is 2 meters above sea level. So the potential for flooding is considerable, let alone the long-term potential for sea level rise. So Taro faces some of the most difficult urbanization problems in the region.
1966 we had about 100,000 people in towns and cities. Now we have 1 million in the towns and cities. And the question is, if we have 1 million now, and Port Moresby is growing at about 4.5 to 5%, and Lae is also growing very fast, and some of the other towns and cities are growing very fast. Growing very fast because people are coming to towns and cities, and they're not coming to towns and cities because there is work. They're coming because they want to come into towns and cities. The country guarantees their freedom of movement. They have the right to move anywhere they want to go. And people now have the mobile phones. Market was for 150,000. Now they say there's 1.5 or 2 million mobile phones in all of the rural areas. And they're seeing what's happening in the world all around them. They have access to Facebook and YouTube and you name it. And so they want to be part of that. And it's encouraging and putting a force on people to move into towns and cities, whether there's something good or not, because they think that's where it all happens. So what we have been trying to do is say, here we have a reality, but we haven't planned for it. We haven't planned for it 10 years ago. 10 years ago, somebody raised it on the floor of Parliament, and they shouted it down. What are you talking about? We are about rural. That's where the majority are.
I think somewhat cynically, sometimes policymakers and even some interest groups outside of government present this discussion of urbanization in a dichotomy. So if you're for urban, it automatically means you're against rural. And that's a false dichotomy. Good urbanization means good schools in rural areas. Good urbanization means adequate health care in rural areas. Good urbanization means increasing the productivity of farm labor so that hands are freed and bodies are freed to move into urban areas to become part of a different sort of economy. So it's a comprehensive approach that's needed. And even if the explicit entry point in the form of an invitation from government doesn't exist, I think that it behooves those of us who are producing knowledge and have access to knowledge to be suggestive and to find the orientation, find the entry points, and exploit them.
Someone was pointing out to me just a few weeks ago is that unlike migrations previously, and let's say specifically in the Pacific, people are doing it in a much more informed way now. With the access to telecommunications, for example, people aren't going into these spaces naively, like, oh, there's some bright lights, I saw it on a television program. They have friends, relatives, I mean, they know very much what they're getting in for. So people are doing it in a much more informed way. So I think we need to be conscious of that. This is not something that we need to be protecting people from. They are making more informed choices about this decision now than they ever have before.
I think it's worth saying initially that we tend to think of urbanization as an issue of migration. And it's not only migration. Certainly one thing is happening, and that is migrants are becoming more permanent. A big phrase in the Pacific 20 years ago was circular migration, but people are less and less likely to circulate now. They're more likely to stay for themselves and for their children's education, their children's future, and so on. But a second thing is happening, and that is people being born in town. Surprise, surprise. And these people have, the people who grow up in town, who are born in town, actually may talk about their home village, but as Max says, when they go back to those home villages, people look at them and say, no, no, sorry, you don't belong. And so there's no rural safety net for those people. They have an urban future, and we have to think about that urban future. And as we're increasingly seeing now in the Pacific, we used to use this nice weasel word hardship until a few years ago. And now we actually are brave enough to say poverty, because poverty is much more visible. And we do need to think about urban residents, because poverty is certainly there in many rural areas, and it's certainly there in large parts, some parts of urban areas as well. So I think what we need is a greater focus on urban planning. We certainly need, very basically, some land use plans in cities, and we need to move, I think, towards a more just and equitable city where we think about the poor and don't marginalise the informal sector. There are too many places where people who are market sellers are victimised by municipal governments and so on. And hopefully cities can indeed become spaces of hope.